Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video. Today I want to do another video on the differences between the INTJ and the INTP. Remember in the last one I gave just some general differences of, the perception differences and, modes of perception and judgment between these two types, which can, for the most part, be explained by their differing cognitive functions. Remember, the cognitive functions are those underlying functions of perception and judgment that really tell you the deeper differences between the types. And these two types, although they seem very similar on the surface, produce a lot of the same conclusions about things and come off very similar socially. They couldn't be more different underneath the surface. They say the things they say and act the way that they act for very different reasons. Remember, the INTJ's functions are the INTP's shadow functions and vice versa. So their main functions are totally different. So they have entirely different ways of seeing the world, processing information, and making judgments about it, and also in the value structures that they appeal to in speech, thought, and action. This is something I was kind of theorizing about for the last couple of days, and I think there may be some truth to it based on my experience as an INTP and my interactions with INTJs, a few of which are my best friends. But I want to relate the differences between these two types to two different philosophical theories of truth. The INTJ favoring the correspondence theory of truth, and the INTP, I think, favoring the coherence theory of truth. The INTJ being a little more left-brained and analytical, being a little more scientifically minded, and appealing to objective structures from which to found their view of reality, are going to prefer the correspondence theory of truth, naturally, I think, which states that statements that we make about the world are true insofar as they correspond with states of affairs in the world. So we need a sort of objective means of gaining information about the world. We detach ourselves from it and appeal to, say, empirical science, the scientific method, in a detached way, and then we make statements about the world on the basis of that information, having no personal investment in it necessarily. The INTP, on the other hand, being a little more right-brained, a little more holistic in their thinking, and a little less likely to detach themselves as, an irrelevant party with regards to the information that they're making statements about. The coherence theory of truth states that there is great value in logic, and that logical consistency among views is at least as important as the objective information itself. In other words, everything's sort of connected in a holistic way under the coherence theory. If one thing were different, if I ceased to exist, if the subject who is studying some state of affairs in reality ceased to exist, and their perception of it ceased to exist, then that would, in some way, even if minor, change the fundamental state of reality on the whole. So it's kind of the view that everything's connected, and not dismissive of the fact that empirical data is important, but that it definitely doesn't tell us the whole picture. So obviously there are lots of versions of both of these theories and lots of nuance that we could go into to explain, which ones are favorable in certain situations. But I think that, and I'm speaking as an INTP here, I have to disclose that, so I naturally prefer coherence theory, but I think it is inescapable that if we take the correspondence theory of truth seriously, that leads us to a sort of relativism. If we take ourselves as subjects out of the truth-seeking process, then we actually have no way of really knowing if our statements correspond with reality. And also, there are deep psychological questions that come up regarding our motivations behind choosing one path of inquiry rather than another, even if it seems that they aren't related. But the coherence theory of truth, in my opinion, actually allows for a connection there. It allows us to explore the psychology that underlies why we ask questions that we do. And you can't separate those motivations even from the subject matter itself. So the INTJ, by their very nature, if this theory that they would prefer, the correspondence theory, is correct, and I think it is, they naturally, unless they transcend that, unless they learn to think more holistically, they will be trapped into a sort of relativist, materialist, physicalist framework. In other words, at best, what we can make use of for our ends, and this is pragmatism, by the way, is the most true thing. But truth isn't something we can really attain, because we live in a sort of detached, objectivist, materialist reality. All that we can know to be real is that which has its foundations in the material realm, that which science can explore. But again, that doesn't account for our own existence as subjects, as playing parts in that process of inquiry. Also, the INTJ, because they will be reduced to a sort of materialist framework, this doesn't allow for any moral truths to exist. And this is really the foundation of a consequentialist moral theory, which is another topic. But consequentialism is essentially the belief that whatever produces the best consequence is morally right. But in a correspondence theory of truth sort of framework, it is relativist. Therefore, we can kind of subjectively choose on our own what is the best consequence in order to produce, and the ends sort of justify the means in that regard. Whereas the INTP, and in a coherence theory of truth, if we're to accept that, regardless of whether you're an INTP or an INTJ or any other type, coherence theory of truth really values consistency among views, that everything's connected, and that our moral framework has to be principled, and it has to have some sort of foundation. Whether that foundation is material or transcendent in some way doesn't really make a difference. But we act from principle and toward the good rather than to produce some sort of consequence. So I think that's one thing that is advantageous in a coherence theory of truth, that it allows for moral truths to exist, because we're not appealing to our subjective minds in order to come up with what are the consequences that are worth producing. We're acting from principle and appealing to something that's greater than ourselves. And if moral truths are to exist, then I think that truth itself has to be something that is greater than us as subjective beings, but also something of which we are a part. So, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but based on, the data that I do have regarding how I think, and other INTPs and INTJs that I know think, this seems to be on track, I think, that INTJs prefer a correspondence theory of truth, whereas INTPs are naturally going to prefer a coherence theory of truth. And both of these theories have, nuances that will deem them advantageous in certain contexts. But overall, I think the INTJ is a little more limited in their overall philosophical worldview. Remember the INTJ, because their correspondence theory is more objectivist, is going to need some of that, philosophical influence from the INTP's temperament to see the big picture. The INTJ is a little more likely to, get trapped into a rabbit hole of very narrow information without regard for the general reality. And the INTP has the opposite problem, can become a little too general in their analysis without regard for many of the details. But I think that's kind of in the nature of being a perceiving personality in any case. So anyway, I hope that makes sense, and that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for the next one. Cheers.